This is getting started with JavaScript for Office 365. I've done this session a number of times before. It started out actually as a for SharePoint session, and now it's Office 365. It's more SharePoint Online focused, but I'm doing more and more O365 parts of it, as opposed to when it first started. And actually tonight will be the first time that I talk about the SharePoint Framework, which was newly announced from Microsoft back in, I think, May, which is their new development model for Office 365, SharePoint Online, and then coming actually to SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint 2016 on-prem, at some point in the future. It's going to be a future enhancement, but for SharePoint Online, Office 365, it should be out. The current estimate is by the end of summer. That's what I heard, so we'll see what time when it gets out and rolled out to first release tenants. For those, if you don't have an Office 365 subscription, they're called tenants, and they're set up to deploy in waves. So you can be like a first release tenant if you want the newest Microsoft releases right away. You can be a regular release, or you can be like a late release tenant. If you have a lot of things that are, if you're heavily customized, you want, a long lead time to get ready to make changes, so you can be a late release. I don't know the official name of it, but you can get them later than everybody else. So, and if you ever want to get up and running with this kind of stuff, you can sign up for a developer tenant through Microsoft. Just go to Office 365, I think it's office.com, and click the links, get a developer tenant, and you can just get up and running relatively quick. I think they're still free, for at least for 30 days to just try it. And you should have all the tools you need to do that kind of work. You don't need a Visual Studio subscription. You don't need MSDN. You can get up and running with Visual Studio Code and a Yeoman generator, which is some of the stuff I'm going to talk about later that you can now utilize for O365 that you previously couldn't. But first, I do have to mention, I work for RDA. This is what we do. We're here in Philly. We're all up and down the East Coast. If you do want to get a hold of us, you can talk to me afterwards. I got cards. You can see Lou. Lou works for my company as well. It's not my company. Lou works for RDA. If you want to hire us for that, or if you need to work for us, or either way. This is kind of what we focus on, but we do have more stuff as well. It's basically to say thank you to them. They support me in doing this kind of stuff, and also obviously thank you to BucksCo JS for having me out tonight. This is me. If you don't know who I am, this is kind of the high level. The best way and the easiest way to get a hold of me is Twitter and then email. I'm on Twitter all the time. But you can obviously email me and some certs, and the Microsoft MVP for Visual Studio and Development Technologies. They changed the names around. That's what it's called now. I focus on the Visual Studio part pretty heavily. That's actually what I'm really into. Other than that, I've been doing jobs, software development, consulting for 12 years now, and a lot of other stuff, blog, tweet, etc., etc. No big deal, but that's the best way to get a hold of me is Twitter and email. And I mentioned this earlier because we were talking about Kyle Simpson and people we follow for JavaScript. So I was a technical editor for these 3 books. They're fantastic. Not just because I was involved in them. The whole series. So I tell this every time I do a JavaScript talk. I tell everybody, listen, you got to get your fundamentals down. And if you're new to JavaScript and you want to get up and running, this is a whole series. You Don't Know JS. It's a series of books. I think they're up to like 7. Go to youdon'tknowjs.com. Redirects to GitHub because all of these are free on GitHub. You don't have to buy any of them. They're free online. Go to GitHub. They're updated as needed. I know he's made updates to some of the original ones that we had worked on. Fantastic books. Really good foundation. If you're like me and you went to school for programming, you probably did C++ and C# and Java and things of that nature. I only did a little bit of JavaScript in college. I didn't get that until I had a few jobs in me. That was obviously where this was all going, and I switched over to do a lot of that. But this was a really good foundation. The last book he wrote is now the first book in the series. It's called like Up and Going. So read that first, and then these. If it's something that is useful to you, check it out. I tell everybody this also because These are helpful for random things that you didn't think they'd be helpful for. Like, if you don't understand how scope works or closures work, pick up the book, read the chapter, figure it out. It also helps for things like how does triple equals work and not triple equals or double equals work, things of that nature, right? They don't work the same way in C# as they do in JavaScript. You get the same answer like 99% of the time, but it actually isn't the same way. It's complicated. If you're interested, I tell everybody, I said, I guarantee you don't know how it works in JavaScript. Not really, not under the hood. And now we're talking, how does the compiler engine evaluate these, and in what order, and what does it really do, and then how do you get that answer? And crazy enough, you get the right answer most of the time. But in the book that I worked on, he has a whole list of exceptions where you would go, that should be true, and it's not. And then you have to walk down the whole path of how you got there and why it's not true. So it's crazy, and if you're a JavaScript geek like me, I found this book fascinating just for the edge cases, if nothing else. So I tell everybody, check these out. Again, they're free, they're on GitHub, and they're a fantastic resource. These are normally more prevalent when I do SharePoint events, when I have to say, look, we got into JavaScript in a different manner than people when I come to JavaScript events. They've been doing this for much longer. Here's kind of how we go. I'm going to talk today, I'm going to give you the overview of O365. For those of you who haven't used Office 365, I'm going to give you the overview of O365, and then kind of how you can get in with some JavaScript. I'll give you some tips. I'll talk about the libraries that I use. I'll talk about a couple niche for JavaScript, maybe not so much in the general community, but I like them, and I usually try to broadcast these out at different events. A couple JavaScript snippets. If you are getting into doing this type of work, if you're going to be doing Office 365 JavaScript development, you're going to want these snippets. And I think they're both available on GitHub. At least one of them is on mine. I have a link to the other one. Then I'm going to give you the demo that I normally do in this talk. And the reason is because everything you're going to see up until the demo is really the way that it has been with Office 365 development, and more specifically SharePoint Online development, since it came out, right? This is a progression from SharePoint On-Prem to the SharePoint Online to the larger Office 365. Okay. This is how you would get up and running, right? And then I'm going to talk to you about what really is coming down the pipe and how it's going to change and why it's important for you to understand that. What you need to know about O365 is what are your JavaScript options for that. So let me get out of here first and see if I can bring up what Office 365 looks like at a high level. Let me go to a different page here quick. This is Office 365. This is the SharePoint Online part of O365. This is my developer tenant. I have it set to first release, which means I get all the latest updates as quick as they come out. It also means I get all of the enhancements, and I get a first crack at anything that may have changed that I would want to account for. It's a lot of document libraries and lists. That's the SharePoint part of it. That's part of the core of what SharePoint does. You have a lot of pages that you set up. You make a lot of dashboards and things of that nature. This is what they call a wiki page, right? We're all familiar with wikis. This is the default page type for a lot of things in Office 365. You click at it, you come in here, you click at it, you type, right? Normal wiki stuff. But if you wanted to do something else, you can add web parts to this, right? It's not just a wiki. This is the way you would add in things. So I'm sorry if you've seen this before. This is the general stuff you need to know to talk about how you would put JavaScript in Office 365. The main way is to come in here, go down to Media and Content, click Content Editor, and then you would add that to the page. I'm not going to do that to this page. This is the quick way to add a Content Editor web part to any page in Office 365 that you can edit. You would add it to the page, and then there's a place to type directly in. If you want to type directly in, there's also a link. You can link it off to another file, which is really nice because the Content Editor web part, it takes in one file type, which is anything you want to give it basically. But what it takes in is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you can even call it a text file. You don't even have to name it with the proper extension or anything. So you post that elsewhere, either in your CDN somewhere, or you can post it in O365. You can upload it somewhere else and reference that file. And it will just run that on the page. So you're writing basically a, quote, single page application, right? You have your HTML, you have your CSS, you have your JavaScript, and it does something all on one page. That's the quickest and best way to get up and running, in my opinion. I'm going to cancel out of this, so then I'm going to go back to that other talk, so you can kind of see what I'm trying to convey. So you saw that. That was the content editor web part, right? I had to show you that because that is really to dip your toe in JavaScript for Office 365 and, again, SharePoint Online. That's really the way you're going to go. If you just want to try something out, if you want to try accessing data or moving things around or making something work, the easiest way is to make your own page somewhere, create your own developer tenant, create a document library, upload a file, make a new page, point at that file, right? And say, put up a div, write some JavaScript, change it around. You're going to go further and further into the things that you normally want to do, but it's relatively easy to get up and running. You just do that, and now you're writing JavaScript. What you do after that is obviously the complicated part, bringing in frameworks, knowing where to put your files. I'm going to cover all that, so you don't have to worry about how would I get up and running. It's that easy to get up and running, and then to do the more complicated stuff, you're just going to add on to that. I'll go through that. The reason I start with that is because that is I'll say it's the preferred method. And the preferred method is also to have a file be referenced. You can type directly in a content editor web part, but you wouldn't because that web part gets saved into the content database. If those of you familiar with how SharePoint works, there's a content database behind the scene and it's custom. And you don't ever go directly against that database. It's Microsoft proprietary, kind of. You don't ever go directly against it, right? And it will save it into that database and then give it back to you. Whereas the file you upload, it won't. It will give you that file back. And the difference is that it will actually parse everything you typed in and sanitize it before you get it in. It's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily want you to put code in there, right? You think, oh, script editor web part. That's probably the way to go because I want to write JavaScript. It is not. It is very similar to a content editor web part. Think you're going to type script in there, but it's going to do the same thing. It is going to parse all your data and sanitize it. So if you even try to type in like a cross-site scripting attack, it will catch it and it'll just delete that out. Like you're not going to be able to do that. Now, caveat, if you wrote a cross-site scripting attack in your text file that you referenced from the content editor web part, it also will not run that. It sees what you're trying to do and it will stop you. They're pretty good at that kind of stuff, at least with O365 and Azure and things like that. But it's a different mechanism that will stop it. When you're typing into the text box, it will get to it before before it goes anywhere. If you're trying to run it, it will catch it real time, basically. So I tell people, you think that's where you want to go, you don't, because you're probably trying to do something complicated, and what you don't want is it to just be sanitized and then spit back out to you, because it reformats your data and your code, and it's kind of annoying. Right? I wouldn't do it that way anyways. But also, if you do something wrong and you break the page and it doesn't render, then you have to drop back, right? When you reference another file, all you have to do is drop back the version and refresh your page. So much less complicated when you mess something up to fix it if your code is housed not on the page that you just broke, right? And now think about it a little bit further. If you're making changes to JavaScript that runs on every page in your entire tenant, the last thing you want to do is break all of them and not have a way to access that file in order to fix it. So saving it elsewhere is key to that. But that is the best way to get up and running, in my opinion. Don't worry about script editor web part. Next, Microsoft makes a product called SharePoint Designer. For those of you who haven't heard it, it's basically a text editor on steroids that also does workflow. It's fine for workflow. If you have to do SharePoint-specific workflow, that's a fine product. You would not use it to edit JavaScript in your tenant online or on SharePoint on-prem. It's tougher to do online. You can do it on-prem. The problem is it does what's called unghosting. So we know SharePoint has a proprietary database, basically. And then it also has blob objects out there. That is all the core files and templates that are used with SharePoint. For all the pages that you have, what it really is a reference to a template file, and then it saves the diff of it. So it can quickly give you it back because there's probably 1,000 pages that all reference the same page layout. Well, what you want to do is serve them up the binary object of that because you can cache that on the web front end, and then just render the diff, right? You don't want to have to give them the entire page every time. If you use SharePoint Designer to edit your page, it saves the entire page and the markup back into the database. Now, every time you access that page, it has to make a full database call, go get it, and bring it all back. And if you start doing this with page on page on page, you will see some performance issues with it at a large level, right? But you also don't have a need to do that. You don't have a need to circumvent the cache. You don't have a need to make these changes and have them be pushed to the database in most scenarios. So you probably want to avoid using that. You could use that as a text editor, but there's better options out there anyways. Especially if, who here has seen Visual Studio Code? Relatively new from Microsoft. It's probably a year old now. So it is cross-platform code editor. It's free, runs on Mac, runs on Windows, runs on Linux. Fantastic. It's got extensions. There's an extension for doing Office 365 development, so can't complain about that. Pretty nice. It's basically a competitor to Sublime Text, which I assume is what most people have at least heard of or use. You guys use it like Eclipse or Sublime, a different one. Okay. Competitor to all that. I really like it, not just because I work at Microsoft MVP, but I actually really like it and use it. I never cared for some of the alternative editors. Super lightweight. It's all written in like Node or something like that. Check it out. It's pretty cool. I actually recommend it later. I used to recommend like Notepad++, but terrible. Hey, you're SharePoint developer. You don't really have. If you're not, it's one of those. If you don't have Visual Studio, which when you do this talk at SharePoint events, you're talking MSDN subscriptions and Microsoft, and everybody has Visual Studio because we already are paying for SharePoint licenses and MSDN access and things like that. So as an alternative to that. I like Visual Studio Code, and there's a lot of support around that. Next, script link versus script. You're probably all familiar with script tags, being this is a JavaScript meetup. However, script link is, I don't know if it exists in any other platforms out there, but it exists in SharePoint and Office 365 as a way to reference in files differently than a script would. It has a little bit of extra functionality in place. Say, wait for this other JavaScript library to load first. So most of us use these to say, wait for it's sp.js, which is the SharePoint JavaScript library that comes with SharePoint or Office 365 that you basically need because it gives you the SharePoint object model and things like that are available to you. So most of us just say, wait for that, right? Normally you would do it the other way, right? We'd all write a script tag and then we'd say document ready, jQuery stuff, like day one, you would just say document ready and wait for that. That doesn't always work for everything you would want because there's, to Microsoft's credit, a lot of these calls are now asynchronous. So you can't always just say document ready because you can be waiting for something to come back. So using a script link is always good, or some other way of referencing and waiting for everything to kind of come back. A quirk of, at least of SharePoint, is the way that they load up data on certain pages. They're asynced out to the nth degree. It's the last call, and then it really takes time to come back for certain things, like for stuff below the bar, basically, will take longer to come back in some scenarios. So waiting for that is key. So knowing that, all that data loaded, and then I want to have, if you want to resize the screen or something like that, you kind of have to wait for everything to come back, which is tougher with async calls and things like that. So those are your two options for writing script tags. You would use script link more if you were doing master page changes. So in SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Prem, there's a master page that you can use, and it's a way to theme out your entire site. That is not the recommended way anymore. So if you're looking at making master page changes, please don't. If you can avoid it, I see some of you making faces like you looked into this. Please don't. Because those can change. not yours per se, but normally when you make a master page, so you get a couple with your SharePoint instance, either on-prem or in Office 365. You get the Oslo master and the Seattle master. And then you want to make custom changes. So what you do, you make a copy of one of those, and then you start messing with it, and then you upload it back up, and you tell your site, use the one I just made. That is normal standard procedure, but it's not recommended anymore because traditionally, changes to those files on-prem have been few and far between without much of a breaking change. In Office 365, there is no guarantee that they won't make a change to it that could cause an issue, and in some instances it has. And the changes happen more often. As Microsoft rolls out more things in O365, they have to make changes for that, be it updating the waffle icon, or moving that around, or making it a little more responsive than it had been before, right? Or adding something new like Delve. If you under Delve, it's a thing in O365. Anyways, there was a point in time when that didn't exist, and now it does, and now we have to integrate that into O365. O365 is a collection of things like Exchange Online and SharePoint Online and Link Online and things like that. So it's just a collection of all these things that you can do. And they have to account for all of that in their master page. So what they call it is a branding tax. If you're going to modify the master page and have a custom master page, that's fine, but you're going to pay a tax on that, which is continually staying up to date on the differences between the original master page that you made a copy of and what Microsoft is continually pushing out to your tenant. This goes back to when we were talking before this session about, did you want to be a first release tenant, a regular release tenant, or did you want to be a later release tenant, right? And it's because of controlling things like master page updates. It's one of the many things that it will control. So be aware that that is out there. There's a much better way if it meets your needs, which is use alternative CSS locations, inject some JavaScript into your site, which I'll talk about how to do in a little bit, but do not, if you can, avoid using the master page unless you have to, and if you're going to do it, know what you're getting into. That's some of the messaging coming out. Be aware of that. Next, you can use what is called a custom action to register your JavaScript file with your O365 tenant, the SharePoint Online part anyway, or again, SharePoint on-prem, same thing. And a custom action is a custom thing that you can do. It does a lot of different things. If you wanted to add a drop-down menu that was custom, you would use a custom action. Or if you wanted to register your JavaScript, it does 50 other things, right? You're doing something custom to your SharePoint instance or your SharePoint Online or Office 365 tenant that you need pretty high-level permissions to do. You want to, like I said, when you click the drop-down, you want to add an extra menu option, right? That's a custom action that you can customize, use a little bit of XML, or you can do it all in JSON, which is the JavaScript object model for SharePoint, essentially. And this is server-side object model, which is not relevant to this, but that's your available options for doing it. I'm going to show you some JSON code later, which shows you how to inject a JavaScript reference into the existing master page and not modifying it. So you continually get the updates without having to change it. So I recommend that as an option. Again, some of this is going to change when I get to the end of this presentation and I tell you about the SharePoint Framework, but until then, this is what you will have as an option. So you can use JSON as an option to inject your JavaScript into Office 365, and that will do every page, right? So instead of doing one page, in which you would have to do, I want to do one page over and over and over again, that's pretty impossible to do if you wanted to do your entire site. So you would need a way to say, for every page that uses this, every page in this tenant, run this JavaScript file and this CSS file, right? That's most of your branding. So use alternate CSS, which is a setting that you can set. You go to site settings, say alternate CSS, pick your CSS file, upload it, and say run your JSON, injecting your reference to your JavaScript file, and away you go. There's another way to do it. You can use, this is CSOM, which is client-side object model, which is very similar to JSON, and not the same as server-side object model. Naming convention. But there's a way to say inject it, and this one says execute. You want to run your function when this is ready and you have context, right? So this goes back to that earlier one about script links, where you can kind of say, oh, do this in this order. That's what you would use client-side object model for. You cannot do this. For anyone who's ever, show of hands, whoever injected JavaScript through CSS? Who had no idea that could be done? Don't do it. You can't do it in O365. I actually tested this little trick of, well, I didn't invent it. Someone else invented it. I tested that trick. It doesn't work in O365. It's squashed.
Is that using a behavior? Or is that really old school?
It's older than that.
Okay.
For those of you who want to know, you can search the internet and find out this answer. The key takeaways are it is suppressed in Office 365, because I already tried it. It doesn't work. And it's a really terrible thing. I don't know why you would ever use CSS to inject JavaScript, but I thought if anybody had learned this trick besides me, they would be at this user group, and I would at least ask. So if you thought about it, don't do it, because you can't. At least in O365, you can't. The last thing I want to point out is this. If you do have Visual Studio, if you are an MS10 subscriber and you have Visual Studio, and you want to get up and running with this in a more traditional way, as opposed to doing what I just kind of showed you, which is just get a developer tenant, go to the site, click here, put up a file, start typing away. You can make your web application or your app or your whatever you're building, and you want access to O365, but you don't want to be in O365 right away. You can add what is called a connected service. This is new for, I think they backported it to Visual Studio 2013, but it's definitely available in Visual Studio 2015 if you haven't seen it. And this will bring you a nice wizard to walk you through accessing your Office 365 tenant data, right? If you want to make an app, you want to have your website and just access that data, or if you want to write an app that is eventually brought into SharePoint, so they have what's called provider-hosted apps, which means you host your stuff elsewhere, and then you just install, like, it's basically an iframe that runs to your site. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's basically what it is. Or you can have what's called a SharePoint-hosted app, which means your app is hosted in SharePoint. There's different things you can do. This is nice because the setting it up and connecting to your data and that kind of stuff is a little tricky. This makes it easier. Now, the thing I'm going to talk about later makes it even easier, but this is nice. So add a connected service is something to be aware of. If you are going to be doing this type of work, know that that exists.
Does it use installs, or is it SOAP enabled, or?
O365 is all, no, that's not true. It is primarily REST. There is a SOAP. It's deprecated, but it exists. It's not gone. It's actually been there since day one. Right here, I'm going to give you that full walkthrough of what your options are to access your data. So that's usually the next thing. Most people don't just want to write JavaScript. They want to interact with their data, and they want to know how. So those are all your options, and I'll walk you through them. This is more for the SharePoint crowd, because I assume everyone in here knows that JavaScript is not jQuery. But not everyone knows that, so be aware. And that's when I usually talk about the books from earlier. So I tell them, go get that. If you were a SharePoint developer and you then came into JavaScript as part of your job, it's usually a different transition than if you had been a JavaScript developer for a much longer time. So I try to give them background, talk about the books, just get some fundamentals in place that are helpful, which will be helpful for SharePoint development as you go along. But more importantly, where do we store our files, right? We have JavaScript files we want to utilize. Where do we put them? So your main options are either going to be in a CDN somewhere, either yours or a public one. There's document libraries. You don't have option. The 15 Hive is not an option. That's an on-prem thing. But previously you were able to, what was called, if you had done SharePoint on-prem development, there are there are ways to push your files directly to the server and then reference them as binaries. You have that kind of access, at least on-prem. You don't have that in Office 365. On-prem, it's referred to as the 15 Hive, the 14 Hive, the 12 Hive, because that was the top level of the file structure, was the number version of the product. Document library, right? If you're going to go to O365, you're probably going to have a bunch of different JavaScript files. Make your own, go crazy. If you do that, you have to account for permissioning and anonymous access. So if you have anonymous access set, you need to add that to your file, or else you'll do the thing where they don't have access to the JavaScript file, and then your site kind of looks funky because one of them didn't load. You can use the site assets library, which is a document library that already exists, and if you enable anonymous access, that has anonymous access already. That will have it automatically turned on for you because that is the site assets. All of those are needed in order to make the site visible to everybody, so if you turn on anonymous, site assets will have anonymous, right? So I use that. I actually use site assets for everything that I do. For anything that's a site-wide, if I'm branding it, or if I'm just doing some functionality for every page, whatever it might be, I use site assets for everything. Otherwise, I use a document library with the site collection that I'm in for just the page that I need it on. And I make my own folder, and I just reference that. CDN. So you can use the CDN when you're doing JavaScript in Office 365. You're probably connected to the internet. Pretty much have to be. You can use global CDNs, right? If you're referencing jQuery or you're referencing Angular or whatever it might be, whatever you want to use, reference them. Go crazy, right? Because you're online. If you're on-prem, this is a different discussion. Do not download a copy of all of them and keep them on your server, because most people who host SharePoint host it at their location, and you wouldn't want your internal interweb to go down if you lost connection because your internet provider went down. You wouldn't want to lose your internal connections, which are still up. So for internal people, I tell them, if you want to use a CDN, that's fine. The first thing you do is have to check if it loaded. If you're on Office 365, use a CDN because you have to be on the internet to access it, right? So you know it's going to be there. Still check, right? Because that CDN could be down for whatever reason. But then you're writing in a reference to a different one, as opposed to on-prem, where you're going to write a reference into your local copy of that. And use the specific version numbers. Don't use the just jQuery.js, because they changed that, and that can break something. General stuff here. You can also use a CDN. You can make your own to reference it. So especially in Azure, you can create a CDN and serve up your own files to your own organization. So that way you're hosting even less in Office 365. You host it in Azure, make it a binary, serve it up, it gets cached, get some performance improvements and things of that nature. You might need it in other places, so it's always a good place to go. So those are your options for that. This is more an on-prem thing. If you enable blob caching, it'll take all of those binary, your JS files, and treat them like binaries, and push them to the front ends, get caching advances and things like that. Here we go, use a rich editor. So in general, I like Visual Studio. If you have MSDN, and if you don't, I like Visual Studio Code. Definitely check it out. I'll be showing that later. I run it on my Mac. I actually run it on my Windows boxes as well. I use it for a lot of different things. But if I don't need the full Visual Studio, I just want to edit some text. If I am doing JavaScript development, I found it to be really helpful. So I actually use that in a lot of scenarios where I don't need the full IDE experience. Right? Check those out. Listen, this is fine. You guys are JavaScript professionals. You don't need that. What are my data access options? So in Office 365, the first thing you need to know about is what is called the Microsoft graph. This is different than the Office graph. They're named similarly. They're different. You need to know about the Microsoft graph. Search the internet for that. You'll find the site. That is the one endpoint to rule them all of Office 365 and Microsoft, even expanding out further into O365 and Exchange and into some Active Directory stuff, I think, is getting rolled in, and other stuff. But that's the spot. And it went 1.0 a few months back, maybe in the fall, maybe in the early spring. I don't remember which conference they announced it at, that it went 1.0. So that's out there, and they're continually enhancing that. There's also a beta branch of that. This is the REST endpoint where you're going to get all your stuff. That's where you're going to go. And there's a graph explorer that you can go to on the website to see what data is there. You put in your credentials, and it lets you look around and say, oh, I have this data and I have this data, so you can kind of code against it. And there's a ton of good information out there, both on Microsoft's websites and on GitHub. If you haven't looked at Microsoft lately, they love GitHub. They are all in on GitHub and Git, like really all in on it. Crazy, absurdly, awesomely all in on that. They have GitHub projects everywhere. I don't know if they enjoy hosting or what it is. They're everywhere. They're really well supported. So there's a ton of documentation out there, right? So definitely go there and check it out. That's your starting point. Know that, go that route. Now, in the current Office 365, there is a bit of overhead involved in getting that set up and getting access to the Microsoft Graph. That overhead is being taken away with what I'm going to show you after the demo. Currently, there's still some setup stuff you need. Still need setup, but trust me, it's not the same level of overhead. There are also the existing REST endpoints that are out there. You do not have to call the Microsoft Graph. You can call the SharePoint Online REST endpoints or the Exchange Online REST endpoints. These are all the endpoints that are getting rolled into the Microsoft Graph, but they're still there, at least for now, as far as I know. So those are your REST options. You can still make SOAP calls if you so desired. I wouldn't, with a few caveats to that statement. One, it's deprecated. It's not gone, just deprecated. SPServices. Who here has heard of SPServices? Okay. SPServices is to SharePoint what jQuery is to JavaScript. It's just the thing that you use because it's awesome and it's pretty foundational. You just use this because that's what everybody uses and it makes your life easy. It is written by Mark Anderson, who's a SharePoint MVP many years over. He wrote this a long time ago and maintains it for every version of SharePoint that exists, 7, 10, 13, 16, and SharePoint Online, Office 365. He is converting it from SOAP to REST to use the REST endpoints, but it started out as SOAP because that was all that was available back in SharePoint 2007. That was your option. It was the SOAP interface. This does all the nice legwork for you. It just makes really pretty code, and then you don't have to worry about making SOAP envelopes and making those calls. The REST endpoints are not 100% feature exact to SOAP. They are working to fix that, but there are still a few little things that you can't get through the REST endpoints that you can get through SOAP. I'll give an example. Recurring calendar invites. One of those things that doesn't come across correctly in REST. It does in SOAP, and so I use SPServices to get that. I'll use the SOAP call to get that, and I know I'll get back the data the way I want it. Like I said, Microsoft is fixing it, but until then, this. The other reason I like SPServices is it makes your migration easier. If you do what I do, and you have to migrate from different versions of SharePoint over the years, from 7 to 10 to 13 to 16, or you go from whatever version to Office 365, SharePoint Online, right? You're doing a migration. You're not just moving code, you're moving branding, you're moving custom applications that were written, you're moving custom code, right? You want to limit a lot of the issues that you're going to run into, and some of that is code related, right? Code doesn't just magically migrate to different platforms and work day one out the box. If you used SPServices to do a lot of your stuff, you're moving an entire abstracted interface, basically. So now, your code doesn't have to change because SPServices works on both versions behind the hood, right? So now, at least part of your migration goes relatively well because you know all of your calls are going to be the same. Other things are going to change. It's not perfect, but it helps you get through that migration, and that's one of the reasons I like it. And again, he's rewriting it to use the REST endpoints, so good on there. The last thing I tell people is the DOM is actually a good place to go get data if you can't get it anywhere else. If you can't figure out how to make the REST call, or if it was going to be a really complicated REST call, or you were going to have to do what's called a camel query. I don't know how maybe we do that outside of SharePoint, but in SharePoint we use camel queries and things like that. And they can get complicated. So in SharePoint, if you have a list of data that you want out and you only want certain data to come back, query that list, get all the data back, and then manipulate it the way you normally would, and then show the parts that you care about. But you can also use SharePoint to do all the filtering for you. You can go into that list and say filter, and choose all the columns, and set all the data the way you want it filtered, and this, that, and the other. And then you only get back that filtered set of data, which is what you really want to do, right? You never want to just bring back all. You only want to bring back the data you care about, performance reasons and things like that, security reasons, performance, whatever it might be. You don't want to get all and then mess with it. So, talking about the DOM, you can just tell SharePoint to make all these changes and do all this filtering, and then once it comes back, move the data around. Maybe you just need to do a little bit. Maybe you want a list that people can edit and do things with. And you just want to pretty it up and add some colors and do that, right? This is a request. I get this request all the time. That's part of what you do in SharePoint. Make the data that came back look a little more user-friendly. Add some KPIs, move data around, add some icons, things like that, right? So just manipulate the DOM. You don't have to write the entire interface to show that data. If you do, I recommend, I like DataTables. It's my personal choice, and I'll talk about that actually later. But you don't have to. You can manipulate it once it gets back to the DOM. So those are your options. The last thing you need to know is what's called a minimum download strategy, which is if you've seen SharePoint or you've seen Office 365, you know that they look relatively similar from page to page. You're going to have the top part of your page, you're going to have the left part of your page, and you're going to have the content of your page. It does not make sense to return all of that data for every page if it doesn't change. So MDS, which is on in 365, will only return to you the part that's changed, usually the middle part of the page where your data is, and it won't return the top and the left. So if you are writing code, I'll give you the example. You wrote a piece of code that was a pop-up because you want to annoy your customers, and you wanted that pop-up to load on every page. And you use the code I give you later to inject it in and run on every page. If you just use the code I give you and don't make it MDS compliant, it will not run on every page, because at some point the page will have thought, I already loaded this piece of JavaScript and it ran and it did the pop-up. Most pages it'll work on, but periodically you'll find one that it doesn't. Now, instead of a pop-up, think branding. And on that one page, it doesn't brand correctly, or it doesn't function correctly. That's where your problem is. So you need to look at, go out to the internet, search for minimum download strategy compliant code, and it will walk you through the steps you need to have so that it always loads. So like I said, the easiest way to test is to write a pop-up that loads everywhere, and you'll periodically see that it won't pop up. This is Visual Studio Code, for those of you who haven't seen it. See Lou? That's just a screenshot of my Mac. That's an older version of it, but it's pretty fantastic. All right, must-have JavaScript libraries. These are the ones that I really like when it comes to SharePoint Office 365. jQuery, I liked jQuery UI for a while. I like the Office UI Fabric. It's relatively new, but it gives it. There was a time when everyone wanted it to not look like SharePoint, and now we're into this phase where they want it to look exactly like. And it's not just for Office 365. It also works for Office products, Word and Excel and things like that. Where if you're a company or you're a third-party company making an add-in, you want it to feel seamless. You don't want it to look like your cool product stuck on the side of whatever you've got. You want it to look seamless to Office products or O365. Microsoft has put out the Office UI Fabric, so you can integrate that, JavaScript and CSS, into your solution, and it will look, it's the same exact branding. So you can utilize that. Talk about SPServices, DataTables I already mentioned, but I'll show you. And I like jqPlot and JS, which I'll get to later, and there's an update to that. Again, you all know jQuery. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with jQuery UI. The Office Fabric is newer. If you are making it, if you want it to look like it, like a Microsoft product, you use the Office UI Fabric. If you're trying to do your own thing, go with jQuery UI or whatever other branding library you want. I've used these throughout my career. That's kind of what I go to. SPServices, I've already talked about this a decent amount. Again, it works for all the versions. It makes your sub calls or your REST calls for you. Just makes it easy. DataTables, love this. If you're doing something that looks like this is the library that I like. There's others, there's like ngGrid or something. There's another good one out there. There's plenty of good ones. I like this. I've used this for a long time. The other thing you always have to consider is licensing, right? I can go out here and tell you, Kendo UI, do, it costs money, right? So this does not. Look at the licensing aspects for your client, your customers. Is it available internally? Can they not sell a product, et cetera, et cetera? These are pretty transferable, but again, check the licensing. I'm not an expert. But I like this. This gives you Your filtering, your search is real time. When you start typing, it just filters the grid right away. It does all that kind of cool stuff. I don't know what else is out there. I know there's plenty of other things that do this. These are just the ones that I've liked and used in SharePoint with relative success. jqPlot is my graphing engine that I like. There's others, 3DS or whatever it might be, but I like this one. It's pretty useful. I'll show you these all in the demo. ADOL, this is what you do need to know. This is for your authentication, your O365 authentication piece, right? That's going to be a little tricky. They're making it easier with the stuff I talk about later, but know this, and then there's another version coming out, the Microsoft authentication library. The .NET part is out, the JS is not out. This is the Active Directory authentication library. That's the first version that came out, so they made another one. Niche JavaScript libraries. So I'm pretty sure everybody knows about Bootstrap. This is starting to get used more and more in SharePoint stuff. Getting that put in and used is a little barrier to that, but it's pretty nice. You can do more and more with it these days with SharePoint and O365. Moment.js though, love this. If you ever have to do any date time manipulation, fantastic. I hate doing it. I hate doing it. I don't like doing it in C#. I don't like doing it in JavaScript. It's just annoying. Trust me, you'll thank me later. If you've never seen this and then you get it and you use it, you're like, oh, awesome. That's how you're gonna feel. I guarantee it. It's so nice for doing things. Here are the snippets that you're gonna need if you're doing Office 365 development. The first one is get SharePoint column internal name. This is lousy, but here's the actual link to it and why you would need it. The reason that you need it is because if you are using SPServices or you're trying to do a query and you want to query and get a specific information from a column, you want to query by the internal name. You don't want to query by the display name because the display name can change, right? You can create a column called Tim, and then you can go and rename it Tim's Awesome Column with spaces and an exclamation point, right? So you don't want to query versus what you see. You want to go get the internal name and then query against that because you know that that's not going to change, right? You can't change the internal name once it's been set. So you need to know this. And again, it's not awesome looking on the projector. Just go get it. You can have my slides. I'll post a link to my slides on the Meetup site. So the other one. This is how to put JavaScript on every page in your site collection in Office 365. So that's not really easy to see, but it's on my GitHub page, so just go get it and use it. Don't call me if it doesn't work, or it doesn't work right. As is, people, as is. I wrote it a while ago, but basically, in order to register a JavaScript file in Office 365, there's a number of ways you can do it. And part of it, the way that it is normally shown, is by making an app or an add-in for Office 365 as a provider-hosted add-in, registering it, setting it up. There is overhead to that, to doing that. It's good, because it forces you to go through those steps. It forces you to have a way of putting it out and bringing it back and doing all of your ALM. Said all that, if you just want to put a file out there and go about your day, you can do it in this code, and again, it's on my GitHub. So go get it, you can use it, buyer beware. So what I do want to show you is what you can do with one content editor web part, one file that you reference, and then that file has a bunch of HTML and JavaScript and CSS references and things of that nature. And that's what this is. This is a basic mock finance portal that I've made up for the purposes of this demo. I have a bunch of lists and libraries on my site right here on the left-hand side where this data that backs this up is held. I am accessing this using SPServices, which is the library I talked about. I use jQuery, I use SPServices, and I'm using jqPlot. That's my plotting engine of choice. Relatively easy to provide your client or your company, whoever you need, We call these dashboards in SharePoint. That's the general terminology. You wanted a finance portal dashboard. Really not that hard. And getting set up with this, most of the code is boilerplate. Like, oh, I want to use jQuery. Good. Go download the library and put in document ready. Done. That's all you really need. Reference that file and you're good. Oh, I want to use SPServices. Great. Go to the SPServices site. I want to get list data. Good. Copy that piece of code out. Put in your list name. Put in your internal name of your column, which we talked about earlier. Put that in. Do your queries. Get your data back. Feed it to jqPlot, right? Go to the jqPlot site. Click pie chart. Get the code. Drop it in. Feed it the data in the array format that it wants. Change a couple names. You know, it's probably 50 lines of code, and I probably changed 8. It's relatively simple. And again, this was earlier when I showed you. Just click content editor web part, add. Then point it at a text file that has your code in and your HTML and your CSS references, and you're done. That's it. It couldn't be easier to produce something like this for a client on a shorter time period. That, if I'm going to get on my soapbox here, that is really the beauty of SharePoint, is that it eliminates all of that other stuff that we spend our time doing as developers. I don't want to rewrite a document object, blob object thing in my database. I don't want to write authentication in my spare time or for a client. I don't want to write a user interface. They want this. They need analytics. They need their data. They don't need you to write the same authentication provider that everybody else has written and got 1,000 votes on Stack Overflow. You don't need that. It's doing it for you. You want to provide value to your client. That is what I like about SharePoint. It is actually a very powerful development platform because you focus on the things that you care about and not on all of the framework setup. That's why I like it. Okay. Anyways, this is it. I realize I'm running out of time, or I'm over time. I'm not really sure how much I have. A few minutes. Let me show you the new stuff quickly so you understand. This is where we came from. Here's where we're going. This is called Preparing for the SharePoint Framework. What should I learn? This was put on by Waldeck Mastercars and BucksCo JS. He works for Microsoft. He's Senior Program Manager. He runs what is called Patterns and Practices. If you see it up there, PNP, as it's generally called, is the main source for development against Office and SharePoint and Office 365. This is, a lot of it's in GitHub, some of it's on Microsoft Channel 9. That is where they put out a lot of their guidance. It's their documents, and it's their best practices and patterns for how to do what you're trying to do. They have gone the full 9 yards. You're doing O365, great. Here's how you get started. Here's the documents. Here's the references. Here's the endpoints. And here is all sample projects. You want to do this? Great. Here's a sample project, right? So these guys have put in a lot of effort into that. It's his job to do that. He is an MVP in SharePoint or O365. And he is big into the SharePoint framework. So they put on a presentation. These are the slides. This entire presentation is on, if you're familiar with Channel 9 from Microsoft, go to channel9.ch9.microsoft.com. That's where they host all their videos for training and purposes and things like that. If you ever want to watch a conference, all of their conferences are now recorded and put on Channel 9. So if you want to watch a build, you can watch it live, stream through Channel 9, and you can watch all the videos on Channel 9. So it's on there, and all the links are going to be there. This is what they are now talking about when they say typical tooling for the SharePoint framework. So all that stuff I just told you, the SharePoint framework is coming. We're now doing all the stuff that you're used to, right? If you were a SharePoint developer, this is probably far more likely to be in your wheelhouse than what we just went through. The SharePoint framework, you are going to be using Node and NPM and Yeoman and Gulp and TypeScript if you want to. You don't have to, it's not required. And Visual Studio, and actually Visual Studio Code, which they like a lot. And now you can bring your own framework in relatively easily. React or Angular or Knockout or Aurelia, whatever it is, bringing them in and leveraging them within Office 365 has been much easier now. You are going to use Gulp. That's how it's going to go. You're going to use a Yeoman generator to generate your projects, whatever type you're going to do. You answer all your questions. Who here has used Yeoman generators before? A couple of you? Awesome. Good. You're going to use Yeoman generators to do SharePoint Framework work. That's what they're pushing out. There's going to be NPM packages for this. You're going to use Node as your foundation for doing this development. You're going to use Gulp as your task runner to do all of your stuff, to listen and build and do your development on top of. You use Visual Studio Code, and you can use anything else that you want to bring in. And I believe O365 is rolling out React as one of its core technologies that is going to be there already, so you don't even have to bring that in. I believe that was the choice. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what they chose as their new UI front end that you can interact with, so you don't even have to bring that with you anymore. That's going to be there.
What about Babel?
Yeah, you can do so Babel that compiles down to ES6, right? Absolutely, any JavaScript you want. So you can do TypeScript, right? So TypeScript is the superset of what is available in JavaScript. Compiles down to ES6, right? 5, whatever the current version is, 5, right? So same thing with Babel. Compile down and push it out. You can do either way because it's all JavaScript. Whatever you end up with pushing out, that's what's going to be there. This slide is for the people who do SharePoint development, where we kind of show them what the parallels are here. If you're normally a SharePoint and a Microsoft developer, you're talking, I use Visual Studio for projects, I use C# to write code, and I have MS Build, right? You know the right-hand side of these two columns, you kind of have to reverse walk them into this, right? So for you guys, this is what it would have been. If you're a Microsoft developer, this is where it's going. But again, I talked about this earlier. This is where it's going. This is what you're going to be using to do SharePoint Framework work. I feel like this is probably a lot more in your wheelhouses than the traditional SharePoint development was that we kind of just walked through. This doesn't fix everything, but this is fantastic. I really like this. I'm not all in on the Microsoft Kool-Aid from the earlier stuff. I actually really like this. I already use Gulp. I already know Node. I already write TypeScript. So for me, I was like, yes, this is great. Really hits modern web development. The rest of the slides, I don't need to go through. This is just your overview of Node and NPM and Yeoman. Again, normally this is an hour and 15-minute session. I do it like a SharePoint Saturday. So we can talk about all of these if you'd like afterwards, but I'm not going to stand here and pontificate about the awesomeness of Gulp or TypeScript or whatever it might be. I'm going to assume you guys know that, and if not, definitely go check them out. There's a ton of resources in here. Here's the Office UI framework stuff, which you guys might be less familiar with than Node or Gulp or things like that. There's options of what you would learn, kind of their opinion, what should I check out in order to get ready for this. Here's what I would check out if I was going to get ready for this. And there's more. I put this list together maybe 3 weeks ago. There's already been updates since then I need to put out. Watch these videos. If you are going to be getting into doing SharePoint Framework work, watch these 3 videos. This will tell you everything you need to know to get ready for this, because like I said, it's not out. It'll be out by the end of summer. This is what you need to know. If you're big on podcasts, if you're not familiar with the Office Developer Podcast, it's a podcast run by the Office Development team. These 2 episodes, I think it's 92 and 93, focused on the future of SharePoint, and then specifically the developer part, and this one focused on the SharePoint framework. So check out that podcast if you'd like, if that's more your style. Then I got a bunch of blogs. If you just want to read about this, here's these 4, and then read these 2. So I got 8 blog posts from either Microsoft or MVPs or people that I really respect and I think know what's going on. They were on a lot of these people were on the inside for this before it rolled out, and now they're publicly talking about it. So check those out. This is boilerplate from Microsoft. This goes back to Office, Dev, PNP, Office 365. A lot of your references that you're going to want to know about if you are getting into doing this, these are going to be your friend. So that's the master list of that. That's me. And then I have more references at the end. So I will publish these slides to the Meetup site. 7:59, so I'm right on time. Thank you.
I have a question if you're going to take them.
Of course.
So are plugins isolated from each other? So if two versions of like if they're both including jQuery but different versions, there's no conflicts?
No, not by default. I believe there's a no conflict flag you can set, but I'm not 100% sure on that. They're not going to conflict.
jQuery you can.
Yes, in jQuery you can.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm saying. In jQuery you can set a no conflict flag for that. In general, no, but they're more isolated. So if you're doing an add-in, so let me caveat that. If you're just putting it on the page, you could have conflicts with whatever is being loaded by anything else. Normally there's not a ton of stuff. It's usually just SharePoint or Microsoft and your stuff. So it's not a big deal. And obviously you're going to want to check that. Again, open up your developer tools or Fiddler, whatever you want. Check that out. Make sure you're not. If you are doing an add-in, that is a provider-hosted add-in, which means it's hosted elsewhere, you're going to have less of a conflict because it's actually hosted elsewhere than just brought into the page to do your thing. But it's not complete isolation. You could have a conflict. It's best to check and have that set. Let your developers know. You could run into each other doing this. Like I said, most of the time I just do a check and see what's going on. I talk to the development team and say, hey, what are you using? I'll just grab whatever version you've got, unless there's a specific need. But it's not isolated that I'm aware of. Hopefully we'll be able to set some of that, I think, in the SharePoint Framework, but that is to be determined. That the SharePoint Framework is actually going the other way into having you have more access than you would if you were a provider-hosted app, which again is hosted externally, piped into SharePoint, wrapped with like a Chrome around the page, and then it's basically an iframe for your stuff. And you interact with SharePoint in the same way you would interact with it if you were sitting at your desk, right? You're making all these client-side calls, which you can make from anywhere, even though it shows. That doesn't meet the needs of everybody, and the SharePoint Framework is going to be more helpful. One of the nice things about the SharePoint Framework is that you're going to be able to eventually, I believe they announced this, make calls to the Microsoft Graph natively from SharePoint Framework hosted code. Whereas now I think you have to set up an app somewhere to do this, or use a proxy or something. There's a little bit larger barrier to entry in order to make graph calls. Originally, you had to make an add-in or something, or provider hosted add-in and register and do some stuff. I think it's easier now, but once you get to the framework, making that call from there, it'll be a native REST call. You won't have to worry about a lot of the other setup that you had. A roundabout way of answering your question. Awesome.
How big of a deal would it be to manipulate a spreadsheet and return that from SharePoint portal?
Glad you asked. Are you a plant? Do you work for them?
Yeah.
So are you a plant? They actually, one of the big
One of the best
announcements,
things about Microsoft was Excel.
great news. They're rolling in web services to the Microsoft Graph for Excel and PowerPoint and Word and OneNote. Excel's the first one. You will be able to use REST calls against an Excel sheet in Office 365 to make updates, to modify it, to mess with it. It's pretty slick.
So it's vaporware right now.
No, that exists in the beta. The rest are
Oh, it's in beta. Okay, but it's not vaporware.
It's not vaporware.
It's not-
The
it's
Excel
shipped.
ones are out. I
But
believe they're
it's shipped.
Excel.
Oh.
The Word and PowerPoint are coming. They were next. And OneNote is either out or in beta as well. And what's cool, they did a demo at one of the, I think it was at the Future of SharePoint event, where they talked about how you could have, I have a PayPal account that when an email comes in notifying me, so you're a small business or whatever, I got a payment. You can have a hook on that sends the email in. You can to your Office 365. You can have an O365, what's called a connector, which will listen. It'll get that. It'll extract the information. It'll pipe it on over to your Excel sheet and enter it in the row. Even if you have it open and are literally typing, it will show up as a separate user and real-time collaborate on that and add that line in while you're manipulating that spreadsheet. And you'll real-time see that data come in while you're working on it. This is what I'm talking about when I say this is the platform for doing this type of development, where that's like a real world thing that is super helpful, and writing the underlying auth takes time. Right? I would rather write that cool part and base a lot of my solutions on top of O365 because I get to do that. That's just that. Again, that's my soapbox on why I like SharePoint. But yes, off of the Excel services and REST endpoints in the graph are out in beta, I believe, at this point.
Awesome. Cool.
Question? Yes.
Back to the beginning. How does C# render triple equals bars instead of, I'm painfully curious. Because if it's not by value and type,
It does.
what am I missing?
It does.
But,
In C#. It doesn't in JavaScript.
wait, it does not.
No. It acts the same. It acts the same. That's the point. And if I try to explain this, I will screw this up. So I'm going to tell you to go there. But what you get is in C# it does that. It does type and value. In JavaScript, how it interacts with that statement and how it's not like it's sort of like a soft cast. I'm drawing a blank on the word, but the way it manipulates that data and casts it into different forms before it does the check is the difference. So it's not exactly the same because and it doesn't always have to check. Like in a double equals, it doesn't have to check. If you string a bunch together, it doesn't have to check the last ones if the first one comes back correct. And in JavaScript, sometimes it will start at the other end. Like it doesn't go in the order if you have like multiple in a row where you want to do checks. It doesn't always start with the first because it's a compiler, right? So it has to get it and then send it over to the compiler. And in the order that it gets it is not the same as the way you wrote it. So it's little nuances. And again, I'm drawing a blank on the word of what it does, but it changes that data before it makes that check. And that's the issue. Because it is not, in the end, it checks, it looks like it's checking type and value. But what it's doing under the hood to get you that answer is not the same. It's very similar, but again, it's how it changes the data. Is it a string? Is it a value? In what form is it when it makes that check is not the same, and in what order it makes those checks is not the same as you would in C#, where you know this is what it's going to do, and it's going to do it in this order, and if I hit the condition I care about, it will drop through. It doesn't need to check the rest, and that's not true in JavaScript. It is in some cases, but not in others, where it might check the last one first because of the way that it got fed, because it actually looks at your code and then breaks it up and then feeds it to the real-time compiler, and then it gets back. Not the same thing, right? If you ever looked in deep on how JavaScript really works, it's different than that. And that's why I tell people you're not going to know the difference until you really dive down into what the compiler's doing. And it's a compiler by compiler basis, right? So Google has their own, Microsoft has their own. How they work is different in each of those. So that was actually the longest part of being a tech editor for that book, which I really like doing. But as a tech editor, you have to make sure that all of the examples work. I have to make sure the examples work in Chrome and Firefox and Internet Explorer and Safari, right? So now you're reading the book, you're making sure that what he is saying is correct, but then you're also checking every example on a minimum of 4 different browsers, and they don't all give back the same answer. It's not like a compiled language first, where you expect the same thing in each one. And I think we realize this at a high level. You know, if you do something in CSS, it's not going to look the same in Safari as it does in Google. Okay. On a deeper level, that's true of the JavaScript. It doesn't look the same coming back out when you use the different engines. So that's why. So again, that's not the best answer because I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, and I can't give you the exact answer. Look at the books, find the edge cases, and start looking through, right? Where it's going to be like, this should be false, and it comes back true, right? It's just one of those mind-blowing things. It has to do with type of, too, right? So you only have so many types in JavaScript. What does it get changed into in order to then do that check? So like if you're trying to do a comparison of like what's in an array, it has to, what was the first thing in the array? That's what we're going to end up being type of, even if the second thing was different, right? So if I have a string and a number and this, and then, okay, I want to make a comparison, well, it's going to convert them into the first thing that you got, so then it has to do a comparison. It's going to do a string comparison versus a number comparison, but then it's going to do another level down, and anyways, I'm screwing this up. But look it up, it's not the same. It's, again, fascinating to people like me. I guess that's why I worked on those books. All right, if there's no more questions, I'm going to look it up, and then we'll go to the bar.
Good.